The glass was thick enough to stop a projectile, and thin enough that I felt every second of silence in that chamber like pressure behind my eyes. I pressed one hand flat against it and watched 47 alien delegations settle into their seats below me. Not one of them looked up. I was in the observer box, which is a pleasant name for a room where you are allowed to watch things but not change them. I had been assigned to Cradle Station for 9 days. I had slept maybe 20 hours total. My back hurt and my coffee had been cold for 2 hours, and the Galactic Council was about to decide what to do with every human being alive. My name is Yara Solis. I'm a commander in the UN Interstellar Corps, and at that moment I held the title of Interstellar Liaison Officer, which sounds like a job that matters. What it actually meant on that particular morning was that I was the only human being in the room where the verdict was being read. Not in the room, above it, behind glass, because humans were not granted floor access during classification hearings. We were witnesses. That was the exact word in the Council Charter, witnesses. The deliberation had taken 6 Galactic Standard days, 9 Earth days. I had spent most of them in a chair outside the chamber doors, which were sealed with magnetic locks and guarded by 2 MHUR sentinels who had made it clear, without ever actually speaking to me, that knocking on those doors was not something I should attempt. Kate Doyle, my aide and the only person on the station who seemed genuinely worried about my physical condition, had brought me meals twice a day and told me to go sleep in a proper bunk at least 4 times. I thanked her each time and stayed in the chair. I could not explain why, even to myself. My being in that hallway changed nothing. The vote was already done, but I could not make myself leave. The lead adjudicator was Elder San, a MHUR. The MHUR are the oldest active civilization in the Council, which means they have been traveling between stars since humans were still drawing animals on cave walls with bone-ground pigment. Elder San was tall, gray, and unnaturally still in the way that very old things sometimes are. He moved to the central podium, and the chamber went quiet in about 4 seconds, not because anyone commanded it. Because when the MHUR speak, other species simply stop making noise. He spoke for 22 minutes. My translation earpiece delivered it in flat, neutral English, the way a machine reads a weather report. Humanity had been assessed. Humanity had been reviewed across 1,200 years of documented interstellar history. Humanity was, by unanimous determination of the Galactic Classification Committee, a Class Omega threat species. The reasons were not argued, they were listed. We were the only known species to have survived 3 separate extinction-level events within a single historical era and emerged from each one not diminished but reorganized. More structured, more inventive, more aggressive in the specific way that builds things. The Galactic record noted, without apparent admiration, that after each catastrophe we had not simply recovered. We had adapted in ways that made the catastrophe itself irrelevant. We had turned our disasters into engineering problems and solved them. We were the only species to have independently developed weapons from 4 separate categories of physics within 4 centuries of leaving our home system. Elder San listed the categories in the same tone he had used to describe our agricultural output. The chamber was completely quiet during that part. I noticed one delegation, a species I did not recognize with long, translucent fingers, shift almost imperceptibly in their seats. We were, and this was the one that seemed to give even Elder San a half-second pause, the only species in recorded galactic history to have regularly returned injured individuals to active service, not under compulsion, by personal choice. The Council's assessment teams had reviewed thousands of documented cases and could not find a pattern of coercion. The wounded had simply asked to return. Many of them had found ways to make themselves more capable than they had been before the injury. He paused after that one. Several delegations shifted. Then he announced the verdict, the silencing protocol. All communications with human-controlled space would be immediately severed. All existing trade agreements suspended without compensation. Every member species of the Galactic Council was formally and legally prohibited from providing humanity with technology, medical materials, navigation licensing, stellar mapping data, cultural exchanges, or any form of material or informational assistance. The protocol would remain in force indefinitely, until humanity formally agreed to binding restrictions on fleet growth, territorial expansion, independent weapons development, and population increase beyond currently registered colony limits. It was not called a punishment. It was called a precautionary containment measure. Elder San used those exact words twice. I stood behind the glass and did not move. I let the translation finish. I let the silence settle, and then I noticed something that surprised me entirely. I was not frightened. I examined that honestly. I am not someone who pretends to be braver than I am. I have been afraid before. I know exactly what it feels like. But standing in that observer box, listening to 47 civilizations decide to cut us off from the galaxy, I felt something much closer to a cold, focused clarity. The kind that comes right before you start solving a very difficult problem. I looked sideways at the other human faces in the observer section. Paul Stone, our senior diplomatic counsel, was writing something on a notepad in small, precise handwriting. Claire Webb, our trade liaison, had her arms crossed and her jaw set. Victor Hale, our military observer, was staring directly at Elder San with an expression I had seen many times on people who were quietly building a plan. Not anger, something quieter, something that calculates. Not one of them looked afraid. The session ended without drama. No ceremony, no formal closure beyond the procedural close of record. The delegations filed out. The lights in the chamber shifted, and the great floor below me went empty and still. I stood at the glass for a few more minutes, looking at the vacant chamber. The podium where Elder San had stood was already being cleared by station staff. A voice came from behind me, quiet and careful in the way of someone choosing each word before releasing it. I voted against it. I turned. Vethka was near the door. He was tall, pale-shelled, with compound eyes that caught the station light in small, bright fragments. He was the senior delegate of the Chorus Collective, a civilization 30,000 years old, and until that week, one of the more thoughtful voices in council sessions. He was looking at me with something I could only describe as genuine regret, the kind that is honest rather than performed. For what it's worth, he added softly. I looked at him for a moment. He seemed to expect something, gratitude perhaps, or grief, or the particular defeated quiet of someone who has just heard that everything they relied on is being taken away. I gave him none of those things. I was not being cold. I simply had nothing to say yet that would be accurate, and I had learned long ago that the most powerful response to someone who expects your collapse is a steady, calm silence. He left. I turned back to the glass. Through a narrow observation port at the far end of the corridor, I could just see Jupiter's outer cloud bands, washed pale and distant at this range. Somewhere past those bands, past the heliopause and the long dark, was Earth. 8 billion people who had no idea what had just been decided on their behalf. I thought about them carefully. I thought about the ice shift survivors who had carved functioning cities out of coastlines that should have been uninhabitable. I thought about the ones who had come through 200 years of open conflict with almost nothing left and still found reasons to build schools and music halls in the ruins. I thought about Victor Hale's face and the quiet arithmetic behind his eyes. I began doing my own arithmetic, not military planning, logistics, supply chains, food synthesis capacity, medical stockpiles, navigation data already archived within human systems, communication relay networks entirely within our own territory. What we had that was ours, what we would lose that we could rebuild, what the timeline looked like if we started moving immediately. Kate Doyle found me in the corridor 12 minutes later and told me the transport was ready. She did not ask how I was feeling, which was one of the things I valued most about her. I picked up my bag. I did not look back at the empty chamber. I walked toward the transport and ran the numbers in my head the whole way there. I got home 18 months after the verdict. Not 18 months of travel, 18 months of watching, filing reports, and sitting in relay posts while two separate governments told two separate versions of the same story to audiences that wanted different endings. The reports I had been filing said, in careful diplomatic language, that the protocol was producing measurable economic stress on human-controlled space. That was accurate. 40% of human interstellar trade had vanished overnight. Food synthesis compounds imported from Velson pharmaceutical networks, gone. Stellar navigation licenses that had given us safe passage through 17 contested transit corridors, revoked. Medical polymer shipments that our colony hospitals depended on for roughly 30% of surgical procedures, stopped completely at the source without transition period or warning. On paper, we should have been breaking. I landed at the New Geneva hub on a Tuesday morning, and the first thing I noticed was that the cargo bays were full. Not empty, full. Crates marked with colony identifiers I did not recognize from the maps I had memorized before I left. New Carthage, Callisto Industrial Division, Mars Fabrication Guild South. Things were moving. People were moving. There was a density of organized activity in that hub that I had not expected, and it had a particular quality that I recognized from only one other kind of environment. It felt like a workshop that had been locked from the outside and handed a deadline. Paul Stone met me at the terminal. He looked like he had not slept properly in several months, which was probably close to accurate, but his eyes were clear and his voice was brisk, and he was carrying a tablet loaded with data he had clearly been waiting to deliver in person. He started talking before we had cleared the gate corridor. The Guild of Applied Engineering out of New Berlin reverse-engineered the Velson synthesis compound in 4 months, he said. Not a copy, an improvement. The new version functions in lower gravity environments, which the original did not. They are already producing at 60% of our previous import volume and expect full replacement capacity before the calendar year ends. I let that sit for a moment. The Velson had spent approximately 800 years developing that compound. We had matched it in 4 months because we no longer had an alternative. What else? I asked. He told me about New Carthage. The colony on Kepler 442b had been among the most import-dependent settlements in the human frontier. Its soil chemistry was incompatible with most standard crop systems, and it had relied on off-world food shipments for roughly 60% of its caloric needs. When the protocol landed, the Council's assessment teams had quietly projected that New Carthage would either accept protocol terms or face a humanitarian emergency within 14 months. That projection had been shared with 3 member civilizations as evidence that the silencing would work as intended. Instead, a botanist named Danny Marsh and a structural engineer named Laura Finn, working out of a prefab research module with second-hand equipment and supply budgets that Paul described as heroically inadequate, had developed a modular hydroponic network designed specifically for low-nutrient regolith environments. The system, already being called the Marsh-Finn lattice in colony communications, had been implemented colony-wide in 11 months. Within 3 months of full implementation, New Carthage was feeding itself. Within 6 months, it had begun shipping surplus food units to 2 other frontier colonies facing similar soil chemistry problems. The Council's projection had been wrong in every direction. I thought of Elder San reading the list of our characteristics in that flat, emotionless voice, adapts in ways that make the catastrophe irrelevant. He had said it as a risk factor. He was not wrong that it was true. I asked Paul about Callisto. He gave me a look that balanced amazement with something that was almost worried. That one is complicated, he said. The situation had started with 4 teenagers. They ranged in age from 14 to 17, and lived in the Callisto residential dome, home to approximately 2,200 people who had lost access to every galactic entertainment network overnight when the protocol was activated. Streaming services, music archives, visual culture platforms, all of it locked behind council-regulated frequencies that human systems were no longer authorized to receive. The four teenagers had decided to find a way around it, not for political reasons. They wanted their programs back. They spent 3 months building an unauthorized signal amplifier in an unmapped maintenance bay using parts that were technically not available for that purpose. In the process of attempting to punch through a council-restricted frequency band, they hit a resonance pattern in subspace that should not have been there by any known model of wave propagation physics. It took them 2 more months to understand what they had found, and when they brought their data to Owen Price, a 17-year-old whose grasp of wave propagation mathematics his teacher had once described as being significantly beyond anything she had encountered in 30 years of instruction, Owen sat with the numbers for 6 hours and then produced a 12-page handwritten derivation. It was a faster-than-light communication method. The Galactic Council had restricted that class of technology to civilizations over 10,000 years old. There was a specific clause in the research limitation statutes that prohibited emerging species from independently developing it. The reasoning provided was that civilizations not yet sufficiently mature could not be trusted with instantaneous cross-galactic communication capability. Owen Price had been trying to pirate alien television. When Paul finished telling me that, I stopped walking. I stood in the middle of the terminal corridor with people moving around me on both sides and thought very carefully about Elder San's half-second pause when he mentioned our habit of sending the injured back to serve. I thought he had been beginning to understand something in that moment. I was not certain he had gotten all the way there. But not everything I came home to was something to feel good about, and I will not pretend otherwise. There had been large disturbances in 4 cities in the first month after the protocol. People were frightened, and people who feel locked in by an invisible authority look for something nearby to be angry at. The government absorbed most of it. Some fell on the diplomatic corps, which meant some fell on people I knew personally and cared about. I read those incident reports on the relay feeds and felt something heavy settle behind my sternum each time. A politician in the Northern Coalition named Fred Carver had spent 6 months constructing a movement around the argument that the correct response to the silencing was not diplomacy but direct action of the military kind. He had a large audience, a talent for making anger feel like clarity, and a message that was not entirely wrong in its diagnosis, even as it was catastrophically wrong in its prescription. I had read his broadcasts from Cradle Station and felt that same heaviness. Not because he frightened me, because the anger beneath his words was real and belonged to real people who had been genuinely wronged, and that anger deserved a better direction than the one he was pointing it in. And then there was the colony that went quiet. I will not name it. Naming it does not serve anything. It was a mid-sized settlement roughly 3 light-years out, a compact station housing approximately 14,000 residents. They lost medical supply access and a critical navigation license in the first week of the protocol. For 6 weeks their signals were normal, then infrequent, then absent. 3 full weeks of silence. When the signal returned, the colony's administrator, a man named Greg Holt, filed a standard status report in a calm, measured voice. All residents accounted for. Infrastructure stable. Some independent resource development underway. He used very careful language throughout. But a technical annex attached to the report contained an energy output reading from their system star that prompted 3 separate astrophysicists at the Earth Science Institute to file emergency review requests within 24 hours of receiving it. I read their review. I read it twice. I did not transmit it to the council. I thought about it for a long time afterward. What I kept returning to was not the fear it produced. It was Greg Holt's voice in that status report. Completely steady, No apology, no dramatics, just a calm man reporting that his people had made it through and that they had found some solutions. The council watched our military posture obsessively. They tracked our ship counts, our weapons research filings, our boundary movements, our communication volumes. They had instruments pointed at all of those things. They were not watching the libraries. They were not watching the maintenance bays where teenagers built amplifiers from discarded parts, or the prefab research modules where botanists solved food crises with second-hand equipment, or the relay archives where 14,000 people on a colony station had quietly developed a capability that should have taken another 8,000 years. The night I returned to my apartment in New Geneva, I sat by the window for a long time and looked at the city. It was not broken. It was louder than it used to be, sharper at the edges, the way a place gets when pressure has been applied to it and it has found a way to hold its shape. I was about to sleep when the alert arrived on my personal relay. A message, encrypted in a frequency I recognized. A frequency I had been told existed by someone who understood both sides of this situation more clearly than most people on either side. I opened it. It was from Vethka. They are watching the wrong thing. They are watching your fleets. They should be watching your libraries. I read it 3 times, sat with it for a while, and then set my alarm for 4 in the morning. I closed my eyes and let the city keep being loud outside the window. That was enough for one night. Vethka's message told me what to look for. Finding it was the more demanding part of the work. I spent the next 4 months moving through the outer rim territories under documentation that listed me as a private traveling consultant, which is the diplomatic equivalent of being officially invisible. Earth's government knew my general location at all times. They did not officially know what I was doing. That separation was intentional on both sides and useful to everyone involved. I was meeting people, not generals or heads of state or anyone whose name appeared in council session records. I was meeting the ones who had voted against the silencing or abstained or gone quiet in ways that meant something specific. Every civilization has them. The people who are not the loudest voice but whose silence during a vote tells you exactly where they stand and why. I found them in places that did not appear on any council meeting schedule. A linguist from the Drow Confederation who spent her evenings translating human literature into 17 dialects of her own language, not because anyone paid her or asked her to, but because she found it genuinely compelling in a way she could not fully account for. A young physicist from the Orient Assembly, who had been quietly distributing human mathematics papers to his graduate students under the label of comparative methodology. A cultural archivist from a small species called the Hemvar who had never interacted with a human in person, but had assembled the most comprehensive external record of human music anywhere in the galaxy, organized not by era or geographic origin, but by emotional category. I listened to all of them far more than I spoke. I was trying to understand something that was still taking its final shape, and I did not want my own assumptions to get in the way of it. Then I went to Velsan. Vethka's homeworld is beautiful in a way that feels slightly wrong to human eyes. Too balanced, too arranged, as if someone with very good taste and 30,000 years of uninterrupted practice had optimized every visible surface for aesthetic harmony, and nothing had been allowed to change since. The Chorus Collective had achieved a level of stability that most younger civilizations could not fully comprehend. No resource conflicts, no territorial pressures, no internal fractures of any kind. Everything in careful, maintained order, generation after generation, millennium after millennium. They had also not produced a single piece of original art in approximately 600 years. Not because they lacked people capable of it, because they had made a collective decision at some point in their deep history that preservation was a higher purpose than creation. They maintained the greatest archive of artistic work in the known galaxy. They restored, they curated, they reproduced with a fidelity that was technically perfect in every measurable way, but they had stopped making new things. The need had faded. Life was comfortable. Everything that needed to be expressed had been expressed. Or so the decision had concluded. Vethka took me through the archive district on the first afternoon. It was genuinely breathtaking in the way of a place where beauty has been held perfectly still for centuries. Every surface preserved, every artifact behind protective fields, nothing permitted to age. I let him show me all of it and asked questions that I meant sincerely. Then, near the end of the evening, sitting in a small room off the main archive corridor, I asked him whether I could play him something. He agreed, curious. I took out my personal relay and played a recording. Not a speech, not political content of any kind. A piece of music composed on New Carthage during the week the silencing protocol was announced. I had found it through Greg Holt's cultural archive, which he had been quietly building from frontier colony submissions since the first month of the protocol. The composer was a 14-year-old girl whose name I never learned because she had uploaded the file under a colony registration code and never attached her name to it. The piece was approximately 9 minutes long. It had been recorded on instruments that were partly improvised, partly repaired, partly rebuilt from things that were no longer their original purpose. It was not technically clean. Several notes were slightly off. The rhythm shifted in places where it probably had not been intended to shift. It was one of the most alive pieces of music I had ever heard in my life. Raw in the specific way that things are raw when the person making them has something they desperately need to say and has found, through instinct and necessity rather than training, exactly the right way to say it. It was grief and it was fury, and it was a hard, clear-eyed refusal to be reduced. And underneath all of those things there was something else, something I could not name precisely, that held all of them up. I watched Vethka while it played. He did not move for the first 3 minutes. Then something changed in the quality of his stillness. His exoskeleton produced a small sound, a very quiet harmonic resonance, like a single string plucked once at low tension. His compound eyes shifted in a way I did not have the language to describe. He remained completely still for the remaining 6 minutes. When the recording ended, the room was quiet. 11 minutes passed, I counted them. Then Vethka made a sound. Soft, composed of several tones at once, with a quality entirely different from anything I had heard him produce before. His cultural attaché, who had been standing near the door throughout, moved his hands in a small, precise gesture. Later that evening, when I asked what the sound meant, the attaché looked at me for a moment before answering. "It is the third tone," he said quietly. "It has not been heard in public in my lifetime. It is what we produce when something reaches us that we were not prepared for." The closest translation in English, he told me, was grief for something beautiful that you had forgotten you were missing. I went back to my quarters that night and understood something more completely than I had before. The Galactic Council had built its entire analysis of humanity around what we could destroy. Their threat assessment was structured around our weapons, our persistence, our physiological and psychological refusal to stop when presented with sufficient obstacle. They had looked at all of that and drawn a conclusion that was not wrong about the facts, but was deeply wrong about what the facts meant. They had missed the other thing completely. The thing that a 14-year-old on a starving colony had produced in the worst week of her young life and released into silence because she needed someone, anyone, to hear it. We were not dangerous because we kept fighting. We were something the Council had no classification category for, because we kept creating, specifically when we had the least reason and the most need to. In the weeks that followed, without coordination from any government body, and without any formal plan, something began forming in the Outer Rim territories. Alien artists who had not produced original work in generations began making contact with human cultural networks through back-channel frequencies. Not politically, not in any way that could be called a movement or a coalition. They were exchanging things. A drow architect sent a set of structural design principles to a human urban planner on Mars and received back a collection of frontier settlement sketches that he spent a week studying without interruption. An Orion composer sent a notation system to a music teacher on Callisto who spent 3 months integrating it into a new compositional method, and then shared that method with 40 of her students. Species that had grown still were remembering what it felt like to want something new, and they were moving toward the thing that was still hungry, the way living things move toward warmth in the dark. The Galactic Council noticed. Their intelligence networks were old and thorough and not entirely blind. An emergency session was called. I was not invited and not officially notified, but 7 contacts inside Council diplomatic structures sent me independent alerts within the same 2-hour period, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously the session was being treated. The session had been called to discuss escalation. The silencing protocol had not produced its intended result on the intended timeline. The cultural activity spreading through the outer rim, which the Council's internal documents referred to as contamination, represented an active disruption of civilizations that were supposed to remain stable. A proposal was put forward, not by a minor faction, by the Mhuer contingent. It was not called the erasure in the formal session record. It was given a procedural designation, but the substance of it was not ambiguous to anyone reading it. This was not a proposal for further isolation or extended economic pressure. This was something permanent. The vote was called. I was sitting in a small cargo relay post near the Hemvar border when the result came through from my contacts, separately confirmed by 3 independent sources within 40 minutes of each other. The room was poorly lit and smelled of recycled air, and I was holding a container of cold synthetic coffee. The proposal had failed. 17 civilizations had voted against it. It had failed by 2 votes. 2 votes. I sat in that room for a long time without moving. I did not feel triumphant. 2 votes is not a victory. 2 votes is a measurement of how narrow the margin was, and the margin was very narrow. I stayed with that. I let it sit exactly as heavy as it deserved to sit. But it had failed, and failure meant something specific. It meant the dissenter coalition that had been forming quietly in the margins was no longer invisible. 17 civilizations had looked at what was happening and decided that the direction being proposed was wrong. That was not nothing. That was a shift in the political balance of a body that had seemed monolithic from the outside for as long as most species could remember. I set down my coffee. I opened my relay and began writing messages, not to governments or diplomatic offices, to people, the linguist, the physicist, the archivist, Vethka. The same message to each of them. It was time to stop working in the margins. What followed was not chaos. I want to be clear about that, because the Council's later records would describe the next 6 months as a period of human provocation and systemic destabilization, and that framing was wrong in every direction that mattered. What followed was not chaos. It was coordination, which is a completely different thing. The difference between those two is enormous, and the Council's consistent inability to tell them apart had been one of their central failures from the beginning. I returned to Earth for the first time in 14 months, not to rest, for a meeting. The meeting took place in a building in New Geneva with no name on the exterior, which meant everyone in the relevant community knew exactly what it was. Paul Stone was there, and Victor Hale, and Sam Briggs, who held the rank of Admiral in the Earth Combined Fleet, and Claire Webb, who had spent the previous year mapping every economic relationship the protocol had severed and methodically building replacement networks in their place. There were 11 people in that room. I had worked alongside most of them for years. We did not talk for long. The situation did not call for long discussions. It called for decisions, and most of the decisions had been substantially made before we sat down. We were there to confirm timing and to ensure that 3 separate actions we were about to initiate did not interfere with each other. 3 moves, simultaneous, entirely different in nature from each other. Sam Briggs managed the first one. Over a period of 3 weeks, she moved the entire Earth combined fleet, 4,200 active vessels, to the outer boundary of human-designated territory. Not a single meter past it, precisely at the legal line. Every ship running full passive observation arrays. Every ship in complete external radio silence, transmitting nothing, receiving everything. 4,200 ships perfectly still at the edge of what was ours, watching. The Council's monitoring networks registered the formation within hours of completion. Their military analysis division spent 4 days attempting to determine what it meant. Preparation for offensive action, defensive posture in anticipation of an attack, demonstration, symbolic gesture, threat. It was all of those readings simultaneously, which was why it worked. The most unsettling message you can send to a civilization that has decided you are driven by aggression is to show them that you are capable of patience. Fear rushes. Patience waits and watches and does not blink. We had been patient for 18 months, and we were going to keep being patient. We were going to keep watching from a position that the Council could not legally challenge without violating their own territorial boundary statutes. According to intelligence coming back through Vethka's channels, several delegations found the formation more alarming than any weapons deployment they had encountered in recent memory. One senior analyst, according to a source I trusted, described it as the most threatening thing humanity had done since first contact. Not because of what the ships could do, but because of what it implied about how long we were willing to wait. Victor Hale sent me a short note after the formation was confirmed in place. "They thought we would rush," he wrote. "We are not rushing." The second move was mine. 2 weeks after the Vidal formation was established, I submitted a formal request for floor access to the Galactic Council's open session, under Article 14 of the Council Charter, which grants any species under active protocol review the right to present a legal challenge before the full assembly. The Council's administrative office responded with 3 separate procedural objections within 48 hours. I answered each one with the precise charter clause that negated it. A 4th objection arrived citing a scheduling conflict. I cited the subarticle of Article 14 that grants the challenging party the right to set the session date, chose a date 3 weeks out, and filed the confirmation before the end of the same working day. The Council's legal division spent the following week searching for a counterargument to the challenge itself. They did not produce one. We had studied their charter more thoroughly than they had expected any emerging civilization to bother doing. I had asked a 12-year-old on Mars, the daughter of one of our navigation engineers, to independently verify my translation of the original text against 4 separate secondary sources. She had returned 2 minor corrections and a handwritten note observing that the Council had itself violated Article 7 3 times in the previous century, without ever facing a challenge. I kept that note. On the day of the session, I walked into the Council chamber through the main floor entrance for the first time in my career, not the observer corridor, not behind glass, through the main door to the floor to the central podium. I stood at that podium and looked at 47 delegations looking back at me. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a speech. I delivered a single formal legal challenge in 12 sentences. The Galactic Council Charter, Article 7, Paragraph 3, states that a silencing protocol may only be imposed upon a species that presents an active and provable threat to galactic stability. The protocol applied to humanity had been justified by predictive threat assessment, not documented active threat. Predictive assessment is a methodology. It is not evidence. The Charter requires evidence. I was formally requesting that the Council produce evidence of active threat meeting Charter definitional standards within 90 Galactic Standard days. If evidence meeting those standards could not be produced, the silencing protocol was legally required to be suspended pending complete review. I cited the clause number. I cited the paragraph. I cited the definition of active threat in the Charter's definitional annex, and the 3 previous cases where that annex had been used as the deciding standard by the Council itself. Then I stepped back and waited. The chamber was very quiet for a long time. Elder San looked at me across the floor. I held his gaze. His face did not change in any way I could read, but something shifted in the way he was sitting, a very small adjustment, the kind that living things make when they have just revised an assumption that they had held without examination for a long time. He said that the challenge had been received and would be reviewed according to Charter procedure. I thanked him and left. Outside in the corridor, Paul Stone was waiting with 2 containers of genuine coffee, which told me he had been planning this specific moment for some time. I took one and drank it while we walked. "The Callisto team found something," he said. I looked at him. He had the particular expression of someone delivering news that is too large to fully hold in one sentence. Owen Price and his team, now formally incorporated into the Callisto Science Division with actual equipment and institutional resources instead of a maintenance bay and repurposed components, had been refining the resonance communication method for months. Part calibration, part genuine curiosity, which in Owen's case was essentially a permanent condition. They had been broadcasting on their resonance frequency for 3 months. Music, mathematical sequences, and what Owen had described in his log as whatever seemed interesting. One broadcast had included a recording of a comedy program from Earth, which Owen noted he had included because it seemed like the most human thing he had available. Something had answered. The response had come from a direction entirely absent from any Galactic Council survey map, a region so distant from known space that even the Mhuor's ancient exploration records listed it as uncharted territory with no projected habitation. The signal was structured, patterned in a way that could not be attributed to natural phenomena, and it had responded specifically to the mathematical sequence, which meant that whatever had sent it had understood what the sequence was. Owen's team had been in correspondence with the source for 3 weeks before reporting it up the chain. Owen's explanation for the delay was that he had wanted to confirm it was real before making any claims. I read that line twice and thought about a 17-year-old who had accidentally rewritten communication physics while trying to steal entertainment programming, and who was now being careful about the epistemics of first contact. The beings, whoever they were, existed entirely outside Galactic Council jurisdiction, not in a disputed territory, not near a recognized boundary, in a region the Council had no authority over and had never attempted to reach. And they had responded to humanity first, not to the elder civilization's ancient beacon networks, which had been broadcasting into deep space for thousands of years, not to the Council's official exploration signals. To Owen Price, broadcasting comedy programs and prime number sequences from a moon of Jupiter, because we were the only ones still talking into the dark with no particular expectation of an answer. In the week that followed, the Galactic Council held 2 emergency sessions that I was excluded from and 1 open session that I attended. The vigil formation remained unmoved. The legal challenge was generating 17 review subcommittees. The Outer Rim Cultural Exchange was now formally documented in Council intelligence reports and could no longer be described as peripheral or unofficial. And somewhere in uncharted space, a team of young researchers on Callisto was learning to have a conversation with beings that the rest of the galaxy had not known existed. Victor Hale sent me a message after the 2nd emergency session. "They are not afraid of our ships," he wrote. "They are afraid that they were wrong about what we are. That is harder to recover from than a military threat." He was right. The damage being done to the Council's internal coherence was not from the fleet or the legal argument or even the new contact. It was from the accumulating weight of evidence that their foundational model of humanity had been incorrect. They had built everything on the assumption that our persistence was a vector aimed outward, at them, at the galaxy, at control. They had not considered that most of what we aimed outward was curiosity. They had not considered that the same drive that produced our weapons also produced our music and our questions, and our habit of broadcasting into silence on the very small chance that something out there might be worth knowing. That night I sat alone in the room assigned to me at Cradle Station and thought about a girl on New Carthage who had put 9 minutes of grief and refusal into a recording and sent it out because she could not keep it in. I thought about Owen Price deciding the most human thing to broadcast into uncharted space was a comedy program. I thought about Danny Marsh and Laura Finn solving an impossible food problem in an underfunded module on a hostile planet. I thought about Greg Holt's voice, steady and calm, reporting that his people were fine. Something had been sitting at the edge of my awareness for several days, not analysis, not calculation, just a feeling that did not have a name yet. I let it stay nameless for now. I was not ready to name it yet, but I let it sit there. That was enough. The formal lifting of the silencing protocol took place on a Tuesday morning at Cradle Station, which seemed appropriate to me because the original verdict had also been delivered on a Tuesday morning at Cradle Station. I do not know whether anyone else noticed the coincidence. I noticed it. It is not a useful habit, noticing things like that. It is a persistent one. The session was scheduled in the main council chamber, the same room, the same central podium, the same ranked seating for 47 delegations. I walked through the main floor entrance the same way I had walked in for the legal challenge and sat at the floor-level table assigned to the Earth delegation. Paul Stone was on my left. Claire Webb was on my right. Kate Doyle was 2 seats down, already writing in her precise handwriting. Victor Hale was not present. He had sent his formal regards and stayed with the fleet, which was still in vigil formation at the boundary of human space. It would remain there until the protocol dissolution was formally transmitted in writing to every member state. Victor had been very specific about that, and no one had argued. Elder San stood at the central podium. He looked exactly as he had the first time I had seen him, the same stillness, the same quality of occupying a room simply by being present in it. He read the formal dissolution statement in Galactic Standard, and the translation system delivered it into my earpiece in the same flat, neutral English it always used. The silencing protocol, enacted against humanity under Article 7 predictive classification, was being suspended pending completed legal review. The Legal Review Board had determined, following examination of documentation submitted by the Earth delegation and corroborating records from 17 member civilizations, that the protocol had not met charter standards for active threat demonstration. Pending final ratification, all trade restrictions, communication blackouts, and navigational prohibitions would be lifted within 30 Galactic Standard days. He did not apologize. I had not expected him to. He read the statement, acknowledged the affirmative votes, noted 4 abstentions, and closed the record. The entire proceeding took less than 20 minutes. 3 years and 8 months of the most consequential political and cultural crisis in human interstellar history, addressed in 20 minutes of procedural language, and then filed in a council archive that perhaps 11 beings in the galaxy would ever read in full. I had been in enough rooms like this over enough years to understand that this was how these things always ended, not with fire or ceremony, with paperwork and a vote tally and the quiet administrative sound of something being formally closed. Paul leaned over. "That is it then," he said quietly. "Most of it," I said. The remaining session was technical, restoration timelines for communication infrastructure, trade agreement renegotiation schedules, the formal establishment of a new council subcommittee to manage the developing situation in what had been designated First Contact Corridor 7, the region of uncharted space from which Owen Price's team had received their first response. That last item generated more discussion than anything else in the session. The contact had been developing for 6 months by that point, and Owen's team had moved from mathematical exchanges to something that functionally resembled genuine dialogue. The beings on the other end were patient, methodical, and apparently deeply interested in human music. Owen had been sending recordings regularly for 2 months. Several council delegations had formally requested access to the Corridor 7 communication logs. The Earth delegation had responded that access would be considered through standard diplomatic channels. That was the polite way of saying that we would decide who joined that conversation and on what timeline. Some delegations had not received that response warmly. I considered our position reasonable. We had found the corridor. We had been the ones willing to talk into the dark long enough for something to talk back. That meant something. After the session closed, the chamber cleared in the usual way of diplomatic gatherings, small clusters of people stopping briefly, aides collecting materials, the quiet, organized dispersal of a formal event that has reached its conclusion. I stayed at the table for a few minutes, not because there was anything left to do there, just because I wanted to feel the room while it still had people in it. I looked up at the observer box. The glass panel was just visible from floor level, slightly reflective from this angle. I could see a faint doubled image of the chamber in it. 3 years and 8 months ago, I had been on the other side of that glass, pressing my hand against it, doing logistics calculations in my head, while 47 civilizations voted on whether to strangle us economically, until we agreed to become something smaller than we were. I thought about the math I had been doing in those first hours, the supply chains and the timelines and the careful inventory of what we had that was genuinely ours and could not be taken away by a protocol or a vote or any external authority. I had not been wrong in any of those calculations, but I had not fully accounted for the things that cannot be inventoried, the things that do not appear in supply chain assessments, the 14-year-old and her 9 minutes of raw music. Owen Price and his sense that the most human thing to broadcast into the void was something that made people laugh. Danny Marsh and Laura Finn in their prefab bay, not solving a political problem or a diplomatic problem, just solving the immediate concrete problem of people who needed food on a planet that was not cooperating. Claire touched my arm and told me the transport was available. "A few minutes," I said. She nodded and left. I sat alone in the slowly emptying chamber and let the past 3 years exist in the room with me without trying to analyze them. There is a particular kind of thinking that happens when urgency finally releases its hold, and you can simply look at what happened without needing to extract a lesson from it immediately. I let myself do that for a while. I thought about the disturbances in those 4 cities. I thought about Fred Carver's broadcasts and the very real pain underneath the very wrong prescription. I thought about the people who had genuinely wanted to accept the protocol terms, not from weakness but from a reasonable calculation that the terms were survivable and the alternatives uncertain. I had disagreed with that position, but I had understood it, and I understood it still. Those people had not been wrong about the danger. They had just been wrong about which direction the danger was pointing. I thought about Danny Marsh and how he had sounded when I spoke with him 3 months ago, cheerful and distracted, and full of 17 things happening at once, none of which had anything to do with the council or politics or the state of human interstellar standing. He had been thinking about soil. He had been thinking about a second colony that had asked for help adapting the lattice to different regolith conditions. That was the whole of his concern. I thought about Laura Finn saying with genuine puzzlement that they had just needed food, and so they had figured out food. That is all. I thought about Greg Holt's steady voice and the annex attached to his status report that 3 astrophysicists had found deeply alarming. I had never spoken to Greg Holt directly. I had decided that was the right call, and I maintained that decision. Some things do not need to be discussed. Some choices are made in isolation, under pressure, without the luxury of oversight or consultation, and the people who make them have to live with what they chose. What I owed Greg Holt was not discussion but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that what happened had happened, and that his people had made it through, and that the choices that had kept them alive were his choices to carry, not mine to interrogate. I thought about Owen Price. He had turned 18 4 months ago. He was now a credentialed researcher in the Callisto Science Division, a title that sat somewhat strangely on someone who had begun his most significant scientific work by attempting to circumvent a communications blackout in order to watch television. He had sent me a message on the day the legal challenge was formally accepted for review. It was characteristically brief. The beings in Corridor 7 sent something new today. I think it might be a question. I am trying to figure out what the question is. No greeting at the start. No closing. Just the update as if we were in the middle of a conversation that had no beginning and no end. I hoped he figured out the question. I was confident he would. I had developed a very specific kind of confidence in Owen Price over the preceding months. The kind that is not based on hope but on observed pattern. I thought about Vethka in the still room on Velsan, making the third tone after 11 minutes of silence, and the attaché telling me it was grief for something beautiful that you had forgotten you were missing. We had not saved ourselves with ships alone, or legal arguments alone, though both of those had mattered and mattered critically. We had saved ourselves in part with a 9-minute piece of imperfect music recorded on salvaged instruments in a colony that was supposed to be collapsing. We had saved ourselves with Owen Price broadcasting prime numbers and comedy programs into uncharted space on the entirely reasonable principle that if something was out there, it deserved to be spoken to. That seemed exactly right to me. Exactly and completely right, in a way that I could not have articulated before any of this began, but that I understood now with the clarity of someone who has watched it actually happen. I heard footsteps. Vethka came through the side door alone, without the diplomatic entourage he usually traveled with. He moved in the unhurried, deliberate way he had when he was not performing the role of council delegate, but simply being himself, whatever that meant for a member of a 30,000-year-old civilization that had recently been reminded it was capable of weeping. He came and stood near the table. "I wanted to say something before you left," he said. "Say it," I told him. He was quiet for a moment, the choosing kind of quiet. When I voted against the silencing, I told myself it was because the evidence was legally insufficient, that it was a rational position based on charter standards. That was true, but it was not the complete truth. What was the rest of it? He turned his compound eyes toward the observer box briefly, then back to me. I had been reading human history for approximately 40 years, not the threat assessments prepared for classification committees, the actual history, the records your people make for yourselves, the written accounts, the personal documents, the things created not for external audiences, but because the act of creating them was itself necessary. He paused. You have a habit as a species. When circumstances are at their most difficult, you make things. You write things, build things, compose things, find things to say, not despite the difficulty. Because of it. The difficulty activates something in you that nothing else activates in quite the same way. I did not say anything. I was listening carefully. The Mhur read that characteristic as a threat vector, he continued. Enhanced capability under pressure. They were not wrong that it makes you formidable, but they identified the outcome and missed what was causing it. The cause is not aggression. I do not have a word in my language that fully captures it. In English, I think the closest is grief. But it is grief that does not remain still. Grief that builds a food system out of incompatible soil, or constructs a legal argument from charter text the opposing party forgot they wrote, or broadcasts music into completely empty space because the silence is unacceptable and something must be said into it. I sat with that for a moment. Grief that does not stay still, I repeated. Yes. The chamber had almost fully emptied. Outside the station in the distance was a galaxy full of things that had not yet been spoken to and were perhaps waiting, as the beings in Corridor 7 had apparently been waiting, for someone willing to keep talking until something answered. "Were you afraid?" Vethka asked then, not as a diplomatic question, as a genuine one. "During any of it, honestly afraid?" I thought about answering quickly and decided against it. He deserved a real answer. So did I. "Yes," I said, "every day. The disturbances in the cities frightened me. The colony that went quiet frightened me. The night I found out the second proposal had failed by 2 votes, I did not sleep. 2 votes, Vethka, 2. I have not stopped thinking about those 2 votes." I paused. I was afraid consistently and honestly throughout the entire 3 years and 8 months. He seemed to consider this carefully. "And yet you did not stop." "No. The Council's model assumed that sufficient fear would produce compliance," he said. "That if the consequences became serious enough, the instinct to preserve what existed would override the drive to push outward. That is how most species respond to that level of threat. They contract, they minimize, they accept terms." "Some of us did want to accept terms," I said. "That argument was made in good faith by real people. I understood it. But fear does not work on us the way it works on other things," I said. I was not saying it with pride. It was simply a description of a fact. "I think it is because we have been afraid so many times in so many circumstances, and found ways through each time that the fear stopped being a signal to stop and became a signal that the thing we are doing matters enough to be dangerous, that the stakes are real. Fear is information, not instruction. It tells us how much is at risk. It does not tell us to stop risking it." I paused. "That does not mean we always respond well when we are afraid. We do not. The riots were fear producing bad outcomes. Fred Carver was fear producing bad reasoning. Those happened and they mattered and they hurt real people. But even in those cases, we were not stopping. We were going in the wrong direction at full speed, which is still different from stopping." Vethka was very still in the way that meant genuine processing, rather than social performance. "Your species frightens me a little," he said at last, not cruelly, almost gently. "I know," I said. "We frighten ourselves sometimes." He made the small sound that I had come to understand was quiet, private humor. "What do you do when that happens?" I thought about Danny Marsh and his soil, about Owen Price and his question that was probably a question, about a 14-year-old somewhere on New Carthage who had composed 9 minutes of necessary music and never put her name on it. "Build something," I said, "or write something, or play a piece of music for a 30,000-year-old diplomat and hope it reaches him." Vethka made the third tone, very brief, very soft, but present, clearly and unmistakably present in the quiet of the nearly empty chamber. I stood up from the table and picked up my bag. We walked together toward the corridor door without hurrying, just moving at the natural pace of 2 people who have said most of what needed to be said and are comfortable with the rest of it existing in the space between them. "The beings in Corridor 7, he said as we reached the exit. "Do you believe formal relations will follow?" "Owen will work out what they are asking first," I said. "Then we will answer. Then we will see what comes from that. And if they are something the Council cannot classify, then the Council will need to develop a tolerance for things that resist classification," I said. "That is generally a healthy development." He made the humor sound again. We parted at the corridor junction. He turned right toward the Council administrative section. I turned left toward the docking bays. I did not look back, not because the moment was not worth a backward glance, but because I was already thinking about what came next. That is a habit I have not been able to break and have largely stopped trying to. Kate Doyle fell into step beside me at the second junction. She had the transport manifest in one hand and a small sealed container in the other, which smelled like genuine coffee. She handed it to me without breaking stride. "Owen sent a message," she said, reading from her tablet as we walked. "What does it say?" "He says he worked out the question," she said. "The beings in Corridor 7 want to know why we were the only ones talking." I thought about that while we walked. The corridors of Cradle Station moved past us on both sides, ordinary and functional, and full of the continuous small business of a place that has spent decades trying to help many different kinds of beings understand each other. Maintenance staff, translation technicians, diplomatic aides moving between offices with tablets and purpose. The ordinary sounds of a place that works at connection as a daily task. Why were we the only ones talking? I thought about 8 billion people who had been told to be silent and had responded by becoming louder to each other. I thought about teenagers who heard nothing but silence and decided to build something that could punch through it. I thought about an engineer and a botanist who heard nothing but silence and decided that silence could not be allowed to mean starvation. I thought about a child who heard nothing but silence and composed 9 minutes of something that made an ancient civilization remember it was alive. I thought about every signal we had ever sent into the dark before we had any evidence that the dark was listening. Every question broadcast on every frequency because the alternative, the silence, was not something we could accept as a final answer. "What did he write back?" I asked. Kate looked at her tablet and then looked at me with a small expression that meant she had been waiting for this particular moment. "He said, because the silence sounded like a question, and we have never been good at leaving questions unanswered." I drank my coffee. It was real coffee, hot and very good. The docking bay doors opened in front of us. Through the transport window, beyond the reinforced observation port, was the galaxy. Enormous and dark in the way of things that are full rather than empty, full of distances and frequencies and things that had not yet been spoken to, and things that had been waiting long enough. Full of questions that no one had thought to ask yet, or had not known how to ask, or had simply been too still for too long to think the asking was worth the effort. We were not too still. We had never been too still. That had been the problem from the Council's perspective, and it was the truest thing about us. I had been doing this job for a long time, long enough to know that nothing resolves completely, that the next years would bring their own complications and disputes and moments where the ground felt less solid than it needed to. The Council would take years to fully ratify everything. Fred Carver's anger did not vanish because a protocol was lifted. Greg Holt's colony was still out there and had done something that had not yet been fully reckoned with. And that reckoning was not going to disappear just because I declined to look directly at it. And the beings in Corridor 7 were only the beginning of something that no map currently showed and no classification committee had a category for. I was not afraid of any of that. I was something else, something that had been sitting unnamed at the edge of my awareness since the night before the session. Something that did not have the urgency of fear but had its own weight, its own reality, its own warmth. The transport lifted. Cradle Station fell away in the observation port, white and angular against the black, getting smaller in the way of things that were only ever temporary stopping points. The galaxy opened in every direction, as it always had, as it always would, enormous and indifferent and full in the specific way of things that have been waiting a very long time for someone willing to be curious about them. I looked at it. I did not look away. The feeling still had no name. I decided it could stay that way for a while longer. Some things are better for being held before they are labeled. We had time.